During the biogeochemical cycles lecture, you learned that matter can move between living and non-living portions of the Earth. Energy is also able to move through ecosystems and gets transformed along the way. This flow of energy through ecosystems will be the focus of this video lecture. All ecosystems need producers, which are organisms that can make their own food using energy from the sun or other non-living things. These organisms are also called autotrophs, which is a term you know already. Most producers, like plants, algae, and some bacteria, perform photosynthesis, where they use energy from the sun to make sugars in the form of glucose. This is why we say that the sun is the main source of energy on Earth. But there are also ecosystems that can exist at the bottom of the ocean, where sunlight doesn't reach. How does that work? Well, producers there have to perform chemosynthesis. They live around hydrothermal vents in the oceans, and they're able to use chemical bonds within the rocks and sediment at the bottom of the ocean as their form of energy, still from a non-living thing. In either case, the producers make glucose that can later be broken down in respiration to provide energy for themselves and whatever organisms eat them. Organisms that can't make their own food are classified as consumers. Also called heterotrophs, these organisms obtain glucose and therefore energy by eating other organisms. Cell respiration is then used to break down that glucose and release the energy as ATP. Consumers can be further classified based on their diets. Those that eat only plants are called herbivores. Those that eat other animals, or are meat eaters, so to speak, are carnivores. Omnivores are organisms that eat both plants and animals. Finally, there's some overlap between detritivores and decomposers. They can include things like fungi, bacteria, earthworms, crayfish even, things like that. But detritivores are organisms that eat dead things and waste, while decomposers are simply types of organisms that break down organic materials, non-living matter, into simpler parts, returning molecules and nutrients to the soil so they can be used again. The various diets of these organisms result in a feeding hierarchy, where one organism eats another. The different tiers of this hierarchy are called trophic levels. The term trophic refers to feeding or gaining nutrients. For most ecosystems, the highest trophic level is the tertiary consumer, or third-level consumer, for reasons you'll see shortly. All ecosystems have producers as their lowest trophic level, because they're able to make glucose from non-living sources of energy that gets passed on to the other trophic levels. The diagram on the right shows an example of ecosystems with their different trophic levels. First are the producers, shown here in the green box. In an aquatic ecosystem, that might be phytoplankton, and on land, it might be plants like grass. Next, you have your primary consumers. These are the organisms that eat producers. So in water, that might be zooplankton that would eat phytoplankton. And on land, that could be a grasshopper eating grass. Your secondary consumers will then eat the primary consumers, and your tertiary consumers eat secondary. Notice also that on the sides of this diagram, there are decomposers and detritivores listed. They break down the wastes and dead remains of the trophic levels and return nutrients and matter back to the soil so that producers can use them again. They do not, however, recycle the energy. That's going to get transformed and eventually lost as heat. Even though that energy is lost to the ecosystem, it's not lost totally. So the rule of energy not being created or destroyed still applies. Instead, that energy just gets lost as heat and radiated out to space. It's still there, just not available to the ecosystem. But this brings up a very important concept. Matter cycles, but energy flows. In the biogeochemical cycles video lecture, you learned that matter has atoms in it that get rearranged and form new compounds that can cycle between Earth's different spheres. Energy, on the other hand, can flow through an ecosystem, but eventually it's downgraded and lost as heat that radiates out to space, so it's not available to be used again. The hierarchy of who eats whom and the movement of energy in one direction through ecosystems are easily represented by food chains. A food chain is a series of steps in which organisms transfer energy by eating and being eaten. This food chain actually has a fourth level consumer, which in this case is the shark. The shark would be classified as a quaternary consumer, or fourth level consumer. At this point in time, you should now be able to fill in the rest of the food chain with the different types of consumers, and of course, the producer in that food chain. So take a moment, pause the video lecture, and please do that before moving on. Unlike the recycling of matter, the transfer of energy is incredibly inefficient. As a rule of thumb, only about 10% of the energy available to one trophic level moves on to the next one. To understand why, look at the diagram of the caterpillar pictured here. Of the 200 joules of energy that's available to the caterpillar, about half of it is lost as waste and heat, shown here by this brown arrow pointing to the feces. Another large portion of energy is used in cell respiration, so the caterpillar can have energy to carry out its life processes, like movement and reproduction and cell transport and those types of things. The remaining 33 joules of energy is actually used to grow by adding biomass. The caterpillar is growing. And that's the only kind of energy that's available to the organism that eats it. So whatever eats this caterpillar, like a bird, for example, would only have the 33 joules that were used to help the caterpillar grow. The joules of energy in the feces or cell respiration would not be available to that organism. Because so much energy is lost at each trophic level, most ecosystems have fewer organisms at the top of the food chain, and they're also limited in how many trophic levels they have. This is why on the previous slide, it was saying that most ecosystems have a tertiary consumer as their final trophic level. This diagram does a nice job of illustrating the 10% rule and its effect on the number of trophic levels. You can see down at the bottom that there are 1 million joules of sunlight energy shining on the Earth. And then of that, about 10,000 joules are harnessed by the plants during their primary production. Only about 10% of this, though, is actually used to help the plants grow and would be available to the primary consumers that eat them. So the primary consumers get only 10% of 10,000 joules, which is 1,000 joules. Then the secondary consumers get 10% of that, which is 100 joules. The tertiary consumers get 10% of that, which is only 10 joules. And so if there was a fourth level consumer in there, they'd have only 10% of 10 joules, which would be just 1 joule. So this is why there are fewer species at the top of the food chain than at the bottom, and also why there are limited numbers of trophic levels. There just would not be enough energy to allow those organisms to survive. Much of what has been described in this video lecture can be illustrated by the trophic pyramid, an example of which is pictured here. The trophic pyramid is a great model for a number of reasons. First, it still kind of has that food chain aspect of showing who eats whom. You can see here that the plants are eaten by the rabbits, which are eaten by the snakes, and which is eaten by the eagle, for example. In addition, the trophic pyramid also shows that producers are like the foundation of an ecosystem. All ecosystems need a producer. Just like the bottom tier of a pyramid is the foundation or support for everything above it, so too are plants, because animals would not be able to survive without plants to harness light energy and make glucose. The trophic pyramid also shows the amount of energy available at each tier. We know from the previous slide that the producers have the most amount of energy available, and because only 10% goes on to the next trophic level, there's less and less energy available to organisms as you go higher. And finally, this shows the amount of biomass at each level. Believe it or not, if you were to add up all the apex or top level predators like sharks and lions and tigers and eagles, they would actually weigh less than all of the producers added up together, which is pretty incredible. As a side note to end this video, note that food webs are much more accurate in their expression of feeding relationships than simple food chains are. Do you eat the same thing every day? Neither do most animals. So food webs show the complexity of organism interactions. It's much easier, however, to study food chains, which is why we devoted most of the lecture to using the food chain model. This concludes the video lecture on energy flow in ecosystems. Should you have any questions, please contact your teacher. Thanks for watching.